Welcome to Restory Nights, where history helps you fall asleep.
In an age when science was at war with superstition, the greatest battle was fought in the dark, after the world had gone to sleep. For the patients of the Dorman Sanatorium, waking up was not a relief, it was a temporary escape. The true horror was not in their nightmares, but in the cure.
The paralysis arrived as it always did, not with a sound, but with a silence so profound it felt like the world had been smothered in velvet. One moment, Ilara was adrift in the shallow waters of sleep. The next, she was anchored to her mattress, a prisoner in her own skin. Her eyes, the only part of her that could move, darted wildly in the gloom of her small bedroom. The moonlight, sliced thin by the window panes, laid a pale, skeletal hand across the floorboards. It began with the weight, a crushing, impossible pressure that settled first on her legs, then her chest, pinning her with the gravity of a fallen star. She tried to draw a breath, but her lungs were bellows that would not expand. A scream, hot and sharp, formed in the back of her throat, but it died there. A silent, frantic pulse against the cage of her teeth. Panic, cold and electric, surged through her veins. She was awake. She was utterly, horrifyingly awake. And then, from the deepest corner of the room, where the shadows pooled like black ink, it began to emerge. It had no true form, this nightly visitor. It was a condensation of darkness, a patch of night that was somehow blacker than the rest. It moved without limbs, slithering across the floor, its presence sucking the last vestiges of warmth from the air. The faint scent of damp earth and decay, the smell of a freshly turned grave filled her nostrils. As it drew closer, a sound began, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from inside her own head, a chorus of unintelligible words that spoke of damnation and decay. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence. She squeezed her eyes shut, a useless defense. The presence was not something to be seen, but to be felt, an invasive entity that permeated her very being. She felt it loom over her bed, the weight on her chest intensifying until she was certain her bones would splinter. A cold, dry touch, like old parchment, brushed against her cheek. This time, the silent scream in her throat found a voice, a strangled, pathetic whimper that was barely a sound at all. And just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The weight vanished. The air rushed back into her lungs in a ragged, desperate gasp. She bolted upright, her body drenched in a cold sweat, her thin nightgown clinging to her like a shroud. The room was empty. The moonlight was just moonlight. The shadows were just shadows. But the smell of the grave lingered, a phantom scent that clung to her pillows and her hair. She sat there, trembling violently, until the first gray light of dawn promised a temporary reprieve. Sleep was not a refuge. It was a nightly appointment with damnation. The morning brought no comfort, only a different kind of torment. Downstairs, the silence at the breakfast table was as heavy as the phantom that had crushed her hours before. Her father, a man whose face seemed carved from granite, refused to meet her gaze, his attention fixed on the spoon stirring his porridge. Her mother, her eyes red-rimmed and fearful, placed a plate of oatmeal before her with a hand that trembled slightly. "Did you have another episode, Ilara?" her mother whispered, the word episode, a clumsy substitute for the words they truly feared. Visitation, affliction, curse. Ilara could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She pushed the tasteless oatmeal around her bowl. Her father slammed his spoon down, the sharp crack echoing in the tense quiet.
"This cannot continue," he said, his voice low and hard. "Deacon Miller saw you leaving the church early last Sunday. Said you looked pale as a ghost. People are talking, Martha. They speak of a darkness in this house." "Josiah, please," her mother pleaded. "She is our daughter." "And our shame," he retorted, finally looking at Ilara. His eyes held no warmth, only a deep, weary frustration. "Have you been praying as Pastor Albright instructed? Have you examined your heart for sin, for some secret vanity or wickedness that invites this thing into our home?" Each word was a stone cast at her. Ilara felt herself shrink. She prayed until her knees were raw and her lips were chapped. She had confessed every sin she could imagine, from a jealous thought about a neighbor's dress to the sin of being terrified. But the shadow still came. A horrifying thought, one she barely dared to entertain, slithered into her mind. What if our father was right? What if there was some intrinsic flaw within her, a rot in her soul she couldn't see that called out to the darkness? Later that day, her mother sent her to the market for thread. It was a short walk, but it felt like a mile-long gauntlet. The town of Havenwood was a small place, where piety was public currency and secrets were a contagion. As she walked, she felt the weight of their stares. She saw the whispers behind cupped hands, the mothers who subtly steered their children to the other side of the street as she approached. Mrs. Gable, whose pies always won the prize at the fall festival, turned her back abruptly to inspect a bushel of apples as Ilara passed. Young men who once tipped their hats now found something intensely interesting in the dirt at their feet. She was no longer Ilara, the quiet girl who sketched birds in her notebook. She was the girl with the night terrors. She was a vessel for something unclean, a source of communal unease. Her affliction wasn't a private suffering. It was a public spectacle of spiritual failure, and in 1890s New England there was no greater crime. Back in the perceived safety of her room, she clutched the spools of thread, her knuckles white. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. In the day, it was just a room, but she could already feel the afternoon light beginning to fade, the shadows lengthening like grasping fingers. Dread was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The sun would set, the lamps would be lit, the house would fall quiet, and she would have to lie down in that bed and wait. That night she tried to stay awake. She sat in her rocking chair, a thick quilt wrapped around her shoulders, and read her Bible until the words blurred together. But exhaustion was a relentless tide, and eventually her eyelids grew heavy. She surrendered, blowing out the lamp and climbing into bed, her body rigid with fear. She prayed for a dreamless sleep, for a single night of peace. The silence came just after midnight. The weight, the smell of cold earth. This time was different. This time the shadowy form coalesced more clearly at the foot of her bed. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, it took on a vaguely human shape, a tall, gaunt figure draped in rags of darkness. It raised a long, skeletal finger and pointed directly at her chest. The silent whispers in her head became a single clear word, spoken in a voice that was ancient and full of malice. Mine. The terror was absolute. It shattered the last of her composure. When the paralysis finally broke, she didn't just whimper, she screamed, a raw, ragged shriek of pure, undiluted horror that tore through the sleeping house. Seconds later, her door burst open. Her father stood there, holding an oil lamp high, his face a mask of fury and fear. Her mother rushed past him, gathering Ilara into her arms as she sobbed hysterically. "It was here," Ilara cried, clinging to her mother. "It spoke to me. It said I was its." Her father strode into the room, his eyes scanning the empty corners. He saw nothing but a terrified girl in a state of hysterics. The flicker of fear in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a grim, chilling finality. He looked at his wife, his voice void of all emotion. "It is decided, Martha. Tomorrow I will send a telegraph. I have heard of a man, a doctor in a sanatorium by the sea. They say he uses science, not prayer, to cast out these modern demons. He will take her." Her mother's grip tightened, a silent protest, but she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Ilara looked from her weeping mother to her stone-faced father and understood. They were not sending her away to be cured. They were sending her away to be contained. She was a blight, a shameful secret to be hidden from the world, and this Dorman Sanatorium was to be her tomb. The thought offered not a sliver of hope, only a new, more terrifying kind of darkness. The week following Ilara's final, soul-shattering scream was one of cold, suffocating efficiency. The house, once a place of tense but familiar routine, became a sterile environment for departure. Ilara was no longer a daughter. She was a problem to be solved, a package to be shipped. Her mother moved through the rooms like a ghost, her hands constantly folding and refolding clothes that were already packed, her eyes avoiding Ilara's as if her daughter's gaze might be a contagion. Her father, however, was galvanized. The telegraph had been sent, a reply received, and a grim purpose had settled over him. He spoke of the Dorman Sanatorium in clipped, authoritative tones, the words science, modern, and rational, forming a shield against the deeper, darker fears he refused to acknowledge. He had read the pamphlet Dr. Dorman had sent. It spoke of a new era in mental therapeutics, promising relief from disorders of the nerves and vapors of the mind. It featured a clinical illustration of a serene-looking woman sleeping peacefully, the terrors of the night vanquished by enlightened medicine. This pamphlet became her father's gospel. He left it on the parlor table, a testament to the logical, respectable path he had chosen. The journey was a blur of gray landscapes and the rhythmic, percussive clatter of the train on the tracks. Ilara sat stiffly by the window, watching the familiar rolling hills and tidy farmlands of Havenwood dissolve into a rugged, unfamiliar coastline. The air that bled through the carriage window changed, losing the scent of soil and hay, and taking on the sharp, briny tang of salt and decay. With every mile, she felt the last threads connecting her to home stretching thin, threatening to snap. A profound sense of abandonment warred with a tiny, traitorous spark of hope. What if this doctor, this man of science, could see what Pastor Albright could not? What if her torment wasn't a stain on her soul, but a sickness in her mind, something that could be named, understood, and cut away? They disembarked at a wind-swept coastal town where the buildings seemed to huddle together against the relentless assault of the sea. A carriage was waiting, as promised. It was sleek and black, bearing a discreet crest on its door, a single stylized letter D entwined with a serpent. The driver, a man with a face as weathered as the nearby cliffs, took her father's instructions and her trunk without a word. The carriage ride was the final terrifying ascent. The road clung precariously to the edge of a cliff, a narrow ribbon of dirt and gravel separating them from a dizzying drop to the churning slate-gray ocean below. Waves crashed against the rocks with a percussive boom that vibrated through the carriage floor. And then she saw it. The Dorman Sanatorium was not the Gothic asylum of her nightmares. It was something far more unsettling. Perched at the very top of the cliff, it was a monument to modernity. A long, stark building of pale stone and dark timber, with vast panes of glass that stared out at the sea like cold, unblinking eyes. Its lines were clean, severe, and geometric. It wasn't a place that held madness in its dungeons. It was a place designed to observe, categorize, and correct it with an unnerving architectural precision. They were met at the grand entrance not by a nurse or an orderly, but by Dr. Alistair Dorman himself. He was a man who seemed to command the very air around him. Tall and dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he had a face that was handsome but intensely intelligent, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He smiled, and the expression was dazzling, a beacon of calm confidence that instantly seemed to make her father stand a little taller. "Mr. Finch, you must be exhausted from your journey," Dr. Dorman said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. He shook her father's hand firmly, then turned his gaze to Ilara. "And this must be the young woman who has been so troubled." His eyes held none of the pity or fear she was used to. Instead, they held a keen professional curiosity, the look of a master craftsman sizing up a complex and fascinating puzzle. He led them into his office, a room that was the epitome of his philosophy. There were no religious icons or comforting homilies on the walls. Instead, there were bookshelves lined with thick medical texts, anatomical charts of the human brain, and gleaming brass instruments whose purpose Ilara could not begin to guess. Dr. Dorman gestured for them to sit, then addressed her father. "Your telegraph described a recurrent nocturnal event, which the local clergy has interpreted as spiritual in nature." He spoke the word spiritual with a delicate, almost imperceptible disdain. "Tell me, Mr. Finch, in your own words." Her father recounted the story, his voice stiff with shame. He spoke of the paralysis, the shadow, the whispers. As he spoke, Dr. Dorman listened intently, making brief notes on a pad of paper. He did not interrupt, his expression remaining one of placid scientific interest. When her father finished, the doctor set down his pen. "I understand your alarm," he said kindly. "In a community guided by faith, it is natural to interpret the unknown through a lens of the supernatural. But here, Mr. Finch, we operate on the principle that the mind is a biological machine. A magnificent, complex machine, but a machine nonetheless. And sometimes its gears slip." He leaned forward, his voice becoming a conspiratorial, reassuring murmur. "What your daughter is experiencing is not a demonic visitation. It is a classic case of hypnotic catalepsy, coupled with severe anxiety-induced hallucinations. The shadow she sees is a projection of her own latent fears, given form by a mind that is temporarily unable to distinguish dream from reality. She is not damned, sir. She is simply unwell." Ilara watched as the tension visibly drained from her father's shoulders. The doctor had given him what he so desperately craved, a scientific name for the horror, a diagnosis that smelled of laboratories and textbooks, not of fire and brimstone. He had replaced shame with a respectable, modern ailment. Only then did Dr. Dorman turn his full, undivided attention to Ilara. "Ilara," he said, his voice softening. He moved from behind his desk to sit in the chair opposite her, creating an illusion of intimacy. "That crushing weight you feel on your chest, that is a physiological response. The whispers you hear, auditory phantoms produced by a brain starved of restful sleep. I want you to understand something. What is happening to you is real, but its source is not in the shadows of your room. It is in the delicate wiring of your own nervous system. He was doing the opposite of what everyone else had done. He was not telling her it was just a nightmare. He was validating her terror, but recategorizing it, stripping it of its power. The shadow was no longer an entity from hell. It was a symptom. "I can help you," he said, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "There will be no prayers or penance here. We will use hydrotherapy to soothe your nerves, a strict dietary regimen to fortify your body, and a regimen of scheduled rest to reset the rhythms of your mind. We will reclaim your sleep, Ilara. We will conquer the fear by understanding its mechanism. You will leave this place whole." His promise was a siren's song. It offered everything she had ever wanted: an end to the fear, a release from the shame. The hope she had nurtured on the train journey blossomed into a desperate clinging faith, not in God, but in this man. The farewell was jarringly brief. Her father, now fully convinced of the doctor's brilliance, shook Ilara's hand as if she were a business acquaintance. "You will do as the doctor says," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her mother's hug was a frantic, silent affair, a last desperate press of her cheek against Ilara's before she was pulled away. Ilara stood at the great glass doors, watching the carriage rattle away down the cliffside path until it was just a black speck against the vast, indifferent ocean. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound unnervingly final. She was alone, cut off from the world in a fortress of science on the edge of the sea. Dr. Dorman placed a cool, dry hand on her shoulder.
Dr. Dorman's smile did not falter as he led Ilara from his office into the sanatorium proper. The reassuring warmth of his words, his promise of scientific salvation, still echoed in her ears, a fragile shield against the profound strangeness of her new reality. He stopped before a tall, severe-looking woman in a starched white uniform, whose posture was as rigid as the building's architecture. "Nurse Gable, this is Ilara Finch," Dr. Dorman announced, his tone light and proprietary. "She is here to rest and recover. Please see her settled in. I have prescribed a mild sedative with her evening meal to ensure a peaceful first night." He gave Ilara's shoulder a final reassuring squeeze, the gesture of a man sealing a transaction, and then turned, his footsteps receding down the hallway with a crisp, authoritative echo. Ilara was left with Nurse Gable, whose eyes, the color of a winter sky, assessed her with a chilling lack of emotion. There was no welcome in her gaze, only a clinical appraisal. "This way, Miss Finch," the nurse said, her voice as starched as her uniform. And so the tour began. The first thing that struck Ilara was the silence. It was not the gentle, living quiet of a library or a church. It was a dead, manufactured silence, heavy and absolute. The floors were made of a dark, polished wood that seemed to swallow the sound of their footsteps. The walls, painted a placid, sterile cream, were bare of any art or decoration that might snag the eye or provoke a thought. The hallway stretched before them, a perfect, seemingly endless corridor. High above, transom windows made of frosted glass allowed a diffuse, shadowless light to filter in, a light that felt more suited to a laboratory than a place of healing. There were doors set at precise, regular intervals along the hall, each identical, each bearing a small brass plaque. "Dr. Dorman's design philosophy is an integral part of the cure," Nurse Gable explained, her voice devoid of inflection, as if reciting from a manual. "The geometric precision of the sanatorium provides a calming, rational environment free from external agitation.
external agitation, Ilara realized, meant everything. It meant the scent of baking bread, the sound of a distant dog barking, the sight of a colorful quilt. It meant life. Here, life had been meticulously edited out. As they walked, Ilara noticed the windows that lined one side of the corridor, offering a spectacular, panoramic view of the tumultuous Atlantic. Yet she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. She reached out and pressed her hand against the thick, cool glass. There were no latches, no sills, no frames that suggested they could be opened. They were vast, sealed panes, turning the raw, wild beauty of the ocean into a silent, two-dimensional portrait. For temperature and air quality control, Nurse Gable stated, noticing her gesture. The air within the sanatorium is pure. It is pure. The unpredictable nature of sea air can be disruptive to the nervous system. Ilara felt the first true flicker of unease. She was in a sealed box. They were not keeping the elements out. They were keeping the patients in. The word tranquility, which Dr. Dorman had used so freely, began to feel like a euphemism for control. Nurse Gable stopped at a door marked with the number 12. Your room. She unlocked it with a key from a ring at her waist and pushed it open. The room was larger than her bedroom back home, but it felt infinitely smaller. It contained only the barest necessities: a narrow bed with a tightly made white coverlet, a small writing desk, and a straight-backed chair. Each piece of furniture was simple, functional, and, she quickly discovered, bolted to the floor. There was no wardrobe, only a set of hooks on the wall. There was no rug on the polished floor, no curtains on the single, enormous window that dominated the far wall. Like the windows in the hall, this one was sealed. It looked directly out over the cliff's edge, offering a dizzying, terrifyingly beautiful view of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. It was a view of immense freedom and power, yet she was utterly disconnected from it, an observer trapped behind an impenetrable barrier. For temperature and air quality control, Nurse Gable stated, noticing her gesture. The air within the sanatorium is pure. It is pure. The unpredictable nature of sea air can be disruptive to the nervous system. Ilara felt the first true flicker of unease. She was in a sealed box. They were not keeping the elements out. They were keeping the patients in. The word tranquility, which Dr. Dorman had used so freely, began to feel like a euphemism for control. Nurse Gable stopped at a door marked with the number 12. Your room. She unlocked it with a key from a ring at her waist and pushed it open. The room was larger than her bedroom back home, but it felt infinitely smaller. It contained only the barest necessities: a narrow bed with a tightly made white coverlet, a small writing desk, and a straight-backed chair. Each piece of furniture was simple, functional, and, she quickly discovered, bolted to the floor. There was no wardrobe, only a set of hooks on the wall. There was no rug on the polished floor, no curtains on the single, enormous window that dominated the far wall. Like the windows in the hall, this one was sealed. It looked directly out over the cliff's edge, offering a dizzying, terrifyingly beautiful view of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. It was a view of immense freedom and power, yet she was utterly disconnected from it, an observer trapped behind an impenetrable barrier. For temperature and air quality control, Nurse Gable stated, noticing her gesture. The air within the sanatorium is pure. It is pure. The unpredictable nature of sea air can be disruptive to the nervous system. Ilara felt the first true flicker of unease. She was in a sealed box. They were not keeping the elements out. They were keeping the patients in. The word tranquility, which Dr. Dorman had used so freely, began to feel like a euphemism for control. Nurse Gable stopped at a door marked with the number 12, "Your room." She unlocked it with a key from a ring at her waist and pushed it open. The room was larger than her bedroom back home, but it felt infinitely smaller. It contained only the barest necessities: a narrow bed with a tightly made white coverlet, a small writing desk, and a straight-backed chair. Each piece of furniture was simple, functional, and, she quickly discovered, bolted to the floor. There was no wardrobe, only a set of hooks on the wall. There was no rug on the polished floor, no curtains on the single, enormous window that dominated the far wall. Like the windows in the hall, this one was sealed. It looked directly out over the cliff's edge, offering a dizzying, terrifyingly beautiful view of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. It was a view of immense freedom and power, yet she was utterly disconnected from it, an observer trapped behind an impenetrable barrier. "For temperature and air quality control," Nurse Gable stated, noticing her gesture. "The air within the sanatorium is pure. It is pure. The unpredictable nature of sea air can be disruptive to the nervous system." Ilara felt the first true flicker of unease. She was in a sealed box. They were not keeping the elements out. They were keeping the patients in. The word tranquility, which Dr. Dorman had used so freely, began to feel like a euphemism for control. Nurse Gable stopped at a door marked with the number 12, "Your room." She unlocked it with a key from a ring at her waist and pushed it open. The room was larger than her bedroom back home, but it felt infinitely smaller. It contained only the barest necessities: a narrow bed with a tightly made white coverlet, a small writing desk, and a straight-backed chair. Each piece of furniture was simple, functional, and, she quickly discovered, bolted to the floor. There was no wardrobe, only a set of hooks on the wall. There was no rug on the polished floor, no curtains on the single, enormous window that dominated the far wall. Like the windows in the hall, this one was sealed. It looked directly out over the cliff's edge, offering a dizzying, terrifyingly beautiful view of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. It was a view of immense freedom and power, yet she was utterly disconnected from it, an observer trapped behind an impenetrable barrier. "For temperature and air quality control," Nurse Gable stated, noticing her gesture. "The air within the sanatorium is pure. It is pure."
The first bell was a blade of sound, slicing through the thin fabric of Ilara's drugged and fitful sleep. It was 6 a.m. The sound was not the gentle chime of a clock, but a shrill, electric ring that demanded immediate, unthinking obedience. She sat up, her head thick with the chemical fog of the sedative Dr. Dorman had prescribed. The stark, geometric lines of her room offered no comfort, only a cold reminder of where she was. The coarse cotton shift chafed against her skin as she swung her legs out of bed and stood on the cold, polished floor. Order, routine. The cure had begun. She joined a silent procession in the hallway. Other patients, all clad in the same anonymous garments, emerged from their identical rooms. There were men and women, young and old, but they all shared a common expression, a dull, hollowed-out look in their eyes, as if the person within had retreated to a distant, unreachable place. They moved without speaking, their slippered feet shuffling in a hushed, funerary rhythm toward the dining hall. The air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the oppressive, manufactured silence. Breakfast was a lesson in deprivation, a bowl of thin, watery oatmeal, unsalted and unsweetened, a cup of weak, lukewarm tea. The meal was not for pleasure or even for sustenance. It was fuel, administered with the detached precision of a mechanic
filling a machine. Nurse Gable presided over the hall from a raised platform, her gaze sweeping across the tables, a silent enforcer of the sanatorium's first and most important rule. There would be no unnecessary sensory input, no conversation, no flavor, no joy. Later that morning, Ilara was summoned to Dr. Dorman's office. He was, as she remembered, charismatic, impeccably dressed, his smile a disarming instrument of power. He gestured for her to sit, his piercing blue eyes alight with intellectual fervor. "Good morning, Ilara. I trust your first night was uninterrupted," he asked, already knowing the sedative would have ensured it. Ilara nodded numbly. I don't remember anything." "Excellent," he beamed, as if she had passed a critical test. "That is the first step, a blank slate. Now the real work can begin. I believe it is essential for a patient to understand the philosophy behind their treatment. It fosters a partnership in the healing process." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, persuasive tone. "Society, and indeed the Church, would have you believe your affliction is the work of an outside force, a demon, a spirit. Archaic nonsense. The truth, Ilara, is far more intimate. The source of your disorder is not external, it is internal." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I call my theory moral somnolence. Somnolence from the Latin somnus, sleep. It is my belief that the will is a muscle. Like any muscle, if it is not exercised, it becomes weak, lazy, atrophied. When the will is weak, the mind becomes disordered. It grows cluttered with fear, anxiety, and indulgent fantasy. Your sleep paralysis, your nocturnal visitor, these are not invaders, they are symptoms. They are the physical manifestation of a lethargic will and a soul that has allowed itself to become disordered." Ilara felt a cold dread mixed with a familiar searing shame. He was saying what her father had said, what Pastor Albright had implied, but he had wrapped it in the respectable language of science. She was not possessed, she was weak. It was still her fault. "But I am not weak," she whispered, the protest feeble even to her own ears. "Of course you are," he said, not with cruelty, but with the cheerful certainty of a teacher correcting a simple sum. "We are all, until we are taught to be strong. That is what we do here. We do not coddle the mind, we train it. The rigid schedule, the plain diet, the therapies, they are not punishments. They are tools to strip away the clutter and exercise the moral muscle of the will. We are going to break your mind of its bad habits, Ilara. We are going to reset it to its factory settings." His smile was bright, messianic. He truly believed he was saving her. But the phrase, "break your mind," snagged in her thoughts, a sliver of glass in a piece of bread. Her first treatment was later that day, in a part of the sanatorium she had not yet seen. Nurse Gable led her down a set of stone steps into a basement level where the air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of bleach. They entered a room tiled from top to bottom in stark white ceramic. In the center was a large claw-footed porcelain tub, surrounded by a complex web of gleaming copper pipes and valves. It looked like a place of sanitation and torture in equal measure. "The hydrotherapeutic calibration," Nurse Gable stated, her voice echoing slightly in the tiled room. "Dr. Dorman has prescribed a preliminary session. Remove your garment." There was no room for modesty or refusal. Ilara undressed, her skin prickling in the cold air, a profound sense of humiliation washing over her. She was no longer a person. She was a body, a subject to be worked upon. She stepped into the tub as instructed, the porcelain cold and unyielding against her bare feet. Nurse Gable did not fill the tub. Instead, she turned a large wheel-like valve on the wall. A thick canvas sheet was suddenly thrown over the top of the tub, covering Ilara and plunging her into darkness. A metal clamp was fastened around the canvas at her neck, leaving only her head exposed, trapping her body in a dark, suffocating tent. Panic flared in her chest. "Relax your body, Miss Finch," the nurse's disembodied voice commanded. "Resistance is counterproductive to the treatment." Without further warning, a powerful jet of ice-cold water erupted from a nozzle inside the tub, striking her back with the force of a physical blow. The shock was so violent it stole her breath. She gasped, a strangled cry escaping her lips as the frigid water hammered against her skin. It was not a shower. It was an assault. It was punishingly, relentlessly cold. Her muscles seized and she began to shiver uncontrollably. "This is the initial shock," Nurse Gable's voice droned on from outside the canvas. "It awakens the nervous system from its lethargic state. It forces the body to obey, which in turn teaches the will to command." Just as she thought she could bear it any longer, the cold water stopped. For a blissful second, there was silence. Then a new valve turned and a blast of scalding hot water shot out, striking the same spot on her back. She screamed, the sound raw and animal. The pain was immediate, a searing, burning agony. She thrashed against the confines of the canvas, but she was trapped. The cycle repeated, icy cold, scalding hot, back and forth. Her body was a battlefield, her nerves screaming under the relentless barrage. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the water. She lost all sense of time, her mind shrinking to a single pulsing point of pain and terror. This was not healing. This was a systematic breaking. This was the exercise Dr. Dorman had spoken of, and it was designed to make her spirit surrender. When it was finally over and the canvas was pulled back, she could barely stand. Nurse Gable, her expression as impassive as ever, handed her a rough towel. "You will rest in your room for the remainder of the afternoon. Contemplate the experience. The body has learned its lesson. Now the mind must follow." Shivering, bruised, and utterly broken, Ilara stumbled back to her room. She collapsed on the narrow bed, her body aching, her mind a numb void. The sedative's fog had been a mercy compared to this horrifying clarity. She finally understood. Dr. Dorman's cure was not about vanquishing the shadow that visited her at night. His method was to create a new, more immediate, and more tangible hell in the daylight. He would inflict so much pain on her body that her mind would become too exhausted, too terrified to conjure its own horrors. He wasn't casting out the demon, he was beating it into submission by beating her. And as she lay there, listening to the dreadful, unending silence of the sanatorium, she knew with chilling certainty that the breaking had only just begun.
For 2 weeks, Ilara existed in a cycle of methodical torment. The 6 a.m. bell, the tasteless oatmeal, the searing agony of the hydrotherapeutic calibration, it was a routine designed to dismantle her. Her days were a blur of exhaustion, her nights a shallow, dreamless void enforced by the nightly sedative. She no longer saw the shadow in her sleep, but the victory felt hollow, for the cure was a horror all its own. She was being erased, smoothed over like a crumpled page being ironed flat, losing all its character in the process. The change came without warning. One afternoon, Nurse Gable entered her room, her face as impassive as ever. "Your progress has been noted, Miss Finch. However, Dr. Dorman observes a persistent resistance in your somnolent state. He believes a more focused environmental therapy is required. You are being moved to the night ward." The name itself sent a chill down Ilara's spine. It sounded like a place of exile, a final destination. Nurse Gable offered no further explanation as she led Ilara through the sanatorium, turning down a corridor Ilara had never seen before. This wing was different. The sterile cream of the walls was a shade grayer, the air colder, and the silence, if possible, even more profound. The doors here had no numbers, only a small slot for a name card. And below the peephole, there was a second, smaller opening covered by a sliding brass plate, its purpose a mystery. Her new room was a copy of the old one, but it felt different, a colder, more permanent kind of cell. After locking her in, Nurse Gable slid open the small brass plate on the door, revealing a narrow grill. Your sedative will be administered through the dispensary chute after the evening meal, she stated before sliding it shut with a definitive click. That night, lying in the dark, Ilara fought the drug's encroaching fog. The sedative was stronger here. Her mind felt like it was sinking into thick mud. Yet, beneath the chemical haze, a new awareness pricked at her senses. The silence in this ward was not empty. It was charged, listening. She felt with a primal certainty that she was not alone in her vigil. A faint sound broke the stillness. Tap, 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 tap. It came from the wall adjoining her bed. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not the random creak of a building settling, but a signal. She held her breath. Her heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Tap, 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 tap. She didn't know how to respond. The sound stopped, and for a long moment there was only the suffocating quiet. Then a new sound, so faint she almost missed it, a dry, rustling whisper, seemingly coming from the heating vent near the floor. "Don't move," the voice whispered. It was a man's voice, thin and raspy with age. "The night orderly does his first round in 5 minutes. Lie still. Breathe slow and deep. He listens. If your breathing is too fast, he reports it." The warning was so unexpected, so jarring, that Ilara's body went rigid. She forced her muscles to relax, mimicking the slow, even breathing of deep sleep. A minute later, she heard the soft tread of rubber-soled shoes in the hall. A shadow fell across the peephole in her door, lingered for a moment, and then moved on. When the footsteps had faded, the whispering began again. "You're the new one, Finch." "How do you know my name?" Ilara whispered back, her voice a dry crackle in her throat. "I hear everything. Walls are thin. My name is Abernathy. I'm next door. Welcome to the place where nightmares come to be studied." Over the next hour, in the precious, unmonitored gaps between the orderlies' patrols, the ward came alive. It was a secret, subterranean world of whispers, a hushed chorus of the damned. She learned that Abernathy was a watchmaker who suffered from chronic insomnia. He hadn't had a full night's sleep in a decade and had been in the sanatorium the longest. "He calls us his persistent cases," Abernathy whispered. "The ones his simple water tortures and starvation diets don't break. This ward is his real laboratory." Another voice joined in, this one younger, laced with a nervous energy. It came from across the hall, the words bouncing faintly off the polished floors. "He likes the dreams. He asks me about my dreams." "That's Thomas," Abernathy supplied. "He was a soldier, fought in the Cuban jungles. He shouts in his sleep, shouts about the fever and the fighting. The doctor says the dreams are a symptom of a weak moral constitution. He says a proper man's mind is a fortress. Mine is a breach. But his treatments, they make the jungle grow thicker, the faces get clearer. Then a woman's voice, fragile and trembling, slipped into the conversation. The machine? Did he use the machine on you? Ilara's blood ran cold. What machine? It was Abernathy who answered. Dorman's new toy. He's been building it for months. Catherine, she was the first one they used it on. It had wires and glass vials with a sweet-smelling liquid. He called it the Somnus apparatus. He said it would help him observe the dream state directly, prune it like a garden. They put a mask over my face. I smelled almonds and lavender, and then I was in my nightmare, the one I'm drowning. But it was different. I knew I was dreaming, but I couldn't wake up. I could feel his voice from the outside, asking me questions while I was sinking. Her voice broke into a stifled sob. When I woke up, he was smiling. He had pages and pages of notes. The image was monstrous. Dr. Dorman, the enlightened man of science, standing over a drowning woman with a notebook and pen. He wasn't trying to save her from the nightmare. He was mapping its depths. Abernathy's voice dropped lower, taking on a chilling, grave finality. That's not the worst of it. Some, they get taken for a final procedure, a complete neurological reset, he calls it, a promise of a permanent cure. What happens to them? Ilara breathed. She already feared the answer. We don't know, Abernathy said. They just don't come back. There was a man, Isaac, a banker from Boston, tormented by figures in his sleep. A brilliant mind, Dorman said, just tangled. 2 weeks ago, the doctor told him he was ready for the final stage. Isaac was ecstatic. He told me he'd finally be free. 2 orderlies came for him in the middle of the night. We heard the trolley wheels in the hall. He never came back. Was he discharged? Ilara asked, a desperate sliver of hope in her voice. A long silence stretched in the dark. It was Thomas who finally answered. His clothes, his books, they were gone the next morning, but his name was just scraped off the card on his door. A new patient was in his bed by noon. We never saw him leave the sanatorium. You can't leave this cliff without a carriage, and we see every carriage that comes and goes from our windows during the day. He vanished, Abernathy confirmed, just like the woman before him and the man before her. We are not his patients, Miss Finch. We are his subjects, and his experiments are getting bolder. The approaching footsteps of the orderly cut the conversation short. A panicked silence fell over the ward. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, her body rigid, her breathing a ragged imitation of sleep. The physical pain of the hydrotherapy, the humiliation, the starvation, all of it paled in comparison to this new, creeping dread. The shadow that had haunted her bed in Havenwood was a simple, primal horror. But Dr. Dorman was a new kind of monster, one who wore a suit and a reassuring smile, who spoke of science and salvation while he peeled back the layers of a person's soul, not to heal it, but to see what lay beneath. And when he was done looking, he simply made them disappear. Lying in the absolute, listening silence of the night ward, Ilara finally understood. She hadn't been sent here to be cured. She had been sent to the final, terrifying stage of a monstrous experiment, and her own nightmares were now the least of her fears.
The whispers in the night ward had become Ilara's only tether to reality, a fragile, secret web of shared fear in the crushing silence. They spoke of Isaac, the banker, of Catherine's drowning nightmare, and of the monstrous machine Dorman was perfecting in the sanatorium's hidden chambers. For a week, it remained a phantom, a story told in the dark. Then, one afternoon, the phantom was given a name and a purpose. An unusual event occurred after the midday meal. Instead of the typical oppressive quiet of the rest period, the heavy tread of multiple footsteps echoed in the corridor. Ilara pressed her ear to the cold metal of her door. She heard the distinct, confident voice of Dr. Dorman himself, a sound rarely heard in the forgotten wing of his persistent cases. "The preliminary trials have yielded extraordinary data," his voice boomed, full of messianic zeal. "We have observed the landscape of the disordered mind. Now the time has come not merely to observe, but to act, to cleanse, to purify." The footsteps stopped directly across the hall. Ilara knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was standing before the door of Thomas, the young soldier haunted by the Cuban jungles. "Mr. Evans," Dorman's voice softened, taking on the persuasive, intimate tone he had used on Ilara upon her arrival. "Your mind is a battlefield. The trauma of your experience has allowed a moral weakness to take root, manifesting as these nocturnal terrors. You have the heart of a soldier, but the will of a convalescent. Today we offer you a chance to be a soldier once more, a pioneer on the greatest battlefield of all, the human mind." There was a mumble of assent from Thomas, weak and laced with a desperate hope that made Ilara's stomach clench. He had been broken by the daily water tortures and the starvation, and now Dorman was offering him an honorable way out, cloaking his experiment in the language of courage. "Excellent," Dorman declared. "Your cooperation is the first sign of a reawakening will. Nurse Gable will prepare you." The door across the hall opened and closed. A few minutes later, Ilara heard the telltale squeak of a wheeled trolley. She scrambled to the peephole, her heart hammering. She saw two burly orderlies flanking Thomas, who was pale and trembling in his shapeless cotton shift. He looked not like a soldier marching into battle, but a lamb being led to slaughter. They guided him onto the trolley and wheeled him away, not towards the main building, but further down the dark corridor to a heavy oak door she had never seen open before. As the door closed behind them, a new sound began, filtering through the vents and the very stone of the building. It was a low, electrical hum, a deep thrumming that vibrated in Ilara's teeth. The somnus apparatus was awake. "Abernathy," she whispered, her mouth close to the heating vent. The watchmaker's reply was immediate, his voice tight with dread. "I hear it. He's never brought it to the ward before. He is growing bold." For the next hour, the hum was the only sound. It rose and fell in pitch, a mechanical beast breathing in its lair. A faint, cloying chemical scent, like almonds and scorched lavender, began to snake into Ilara's room, making her dizzy. This was the smell Catherine had described. This was the smell of the machine. Then the voices began, muffled by the thick oak door, but audible in the deathly quiet. Dr. Dorman's voice was calm, clinical. "Describe the environment, Thomas. What do you see? Speak clearly for the recording." Thomas's voice was faint, slurred. "Trees, so many trees, thick. The air is wet, hot. I can feel the leaves on my face." "Excellent," Dorman's voice purred. "The apparatus is establishing a perfect synaptic link to the memory center. We are inside the dream, Thomas. Now we will introduce the purifying agent. You may feel a slight disorientation. This is the disordered part of your psyche being neutralized." The hum of the machine suddenly escalated, its pitch rising to a sharp, painful whine. Through the vent, Ilara could hear Thomas's breathing quicken, becoming ragged. "The leaves, they're not leaves. They're grabbing me. Their hands, so many hands, pulling me down into the mud. This is a fabrication of your fear, Dorman's voice cut in, still unnervingly calm. Your weakened will is resisting purification. Observe it, Thomas. Do not participate in it. Command it to cease. I can't. God, I can't. They're everywhere. The faces. I see the faces of the men who fell. They're rotting. Their eyes are... Oh, God, make it stop. Doctor, please. What happened next was not a scream from a nightmare. Ilara had heard men scream in pain and fear before, but this was a sound stripped of all humanity. It was a raw, guttural shriek of a mind being torn apart from the inside. It was the sound of a soul being unmade. The shriek went on, punctuated by violent thrashing sounds. The machine's whine rose to a fever pitch, and Ilara heard the distinct pop and shatter of glass, followed by Dorman's sharp curse. And then, silence. The scream did not fade. It was severed, cut off as if by a knife. The high-pitched whine of the machine died down, returning to its low, predatory hum. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a dead, absolute void. "Abernathy?" she whispered, her voice trembling so hard she could barely form the word. There was no reply. For what felt like an eternity, the night ward held its collective breath. Then the heavy oak door creaked open. Ilara scrambled back to her peephole, her heart hammering. She saw two burly orderlies flanking Thomas, who was pale and trembling in his shapeless cotton shift. He looked not like a soldier marching into battle, but a lamb being led to slaughter. They guided him onto the trolley and wheeled him away, not towards the main building, but further down the dark corridor to a heavy oak door she had never seen open before. As the door closed behind them, a new sound began, filtering through the vents and the very stone of the building. It was a low, electrical hum, a deep thrumming that vibrated in Ilara's teeth. The somnus apparatus was awake. "Abernathy," she whispered, her mouth close to the heating vent. The watchmaker's reply was immediate, his voice tight with dread. "I hear it. He's never brought it to the ward before. He is growing bold." For the next hour, the hum was the only sound. It rose and fell in pitch, a mechanical beast breathing in its lair. A faint, cloying chemical scent, like almonds and scorched lavender, began to snake into Ilara's room, making her dizzy. This was the smell Catherine had described. This was the smell of the machine. Then the voices began, muffled by the thick oak door, but audible in the deathly quiet. Dr. Dorman's voice was calm, clinical. "Describe the environment, Thomas. What do you see? Speak clearly for the recording." Thomas's voice was faint, slurred. "Trees, so many trees, thick. The air is wet, hot. I can feel the leaves on my face." "Excellent," Dorman's voice purred. "The apparatus is establishing a perfect synaptic link to the memory center. We are inside the dream, Thomas. Now we will introduce the purifying agent. You may feel a slight disorientation. This is the disordered part of your psyche being neutralized." The hum of the machine suddenly escalated, its pitch rising to a sharp, painful whine. Through the vent, Ilara could hear Thomas's breathing quicken, becoming ragged. "The leaves, they're not leaves. They're grabbing me. Their hands, so many hands, pulling me down into the mud." "This is a fabrication of your fear," Dorman's voice cut in, still unnervingly calm. "Your weakened will is resisting purification. Observe it, Thomas. Do not participate in it. Command it to cease." "I can't. God, I can't. They're everywhere. The faces. I see the faces of the men who fell. They're rotting. Their eyes are... Oh, God, make it stop. Doctor, please. What happened next was not a scream from a nightmare. Ilara had heard men scream in pain and fear before, but this was a sound stripped of all humanity. It was a raw, guttural shriek of a mind being torn apart from the inside. It was the sound of a soul being unmade. The shriek went on, punctuated by violent thrashing sounds. The machines...
The silence left by Thomas's scream was a living entity. It settled in the night ward, thicker and more suffocating than before, a constant reminder of the void he had left behind. For Ilara, the terror had metastasized. It was no longer a passive dread of the night, but an active, cold-blooded fear for her own survival. The Somnus apparatus was not a distant threat. It was a looming appointment. She understood with chilling clarity that Dorman would not be satisfied with one spectacular result. He was a collector, and she, with her unique and vivid night terrors, was a prized specimen he had yet to acquire. This knowledge forged a new resolve in the crucible of her fear. She became a model patient. She ate the tasteless oatmeal without protest, endured the hydrotherapy with a feigned, broken submission, and swallowed the nightly sedative with a placid obedience that seemed to please Nurse Gable. She learned to control her breathing when the orderly passed, to keep her eyes shut, to become a part of the sanatorium's architecture of insomnia. She was no longer waiting for a cure, she was waiting for an opportunity. She observed the staff's routines, the timing of the patrols, the way a loose floorboard near her bed creaked when stepped on. Her mind, once a canvas for nightmares, was now a map of her prison, charting every potential path to escape. Her opportunity arrived not with a thunderclap, but in a quiet, unexpected flicker of humanity. A new nurse was assigned to the morning shift in the night ward. She was young, perhaps no older than Ilara herself, with a pale face and large expressive brown eyes that had not yet acquired the flat, hardened look of the other staff members. Her name, Ilara learned from the whispers in the vents, was Anna. Unlike the others, Anna did not treat the patients like objects. When she placed the bowl of oatmeal in front of Ilara, her fingers brushed against Ilara's, and for a fleeting second, her eyes met Ilara's with an expression of profound, unmistakable pity. It was a tiny crack in the sanatorium's cold facade, but it was enough for a sliver of desperate hope to take root. She knew she had to take a risk. A direct question was impossible, but a subtle test might work. A few days later, during the weekly supervised hour of recreation, a slow, silent march around a small, high-walled courtyard, Ilara stumbled, feigning a wave of dizziness. As she had hoped, Anna was the one who rushed to her side, helping her to a cold stone bench slightly away from the others. Nurse Gable watched them with her hawk-like eyes, but did not intervene. "Just a moment's weakness," Ilara murmured, her head bowed. Then, her voice barely a whisper, she asked the question, loading it with a desperate, feigned innocence. "I pray for Mr. Evans sometimes. I hope he is happy to be home with his family." She felt Anna stiffen beside her. The young nurse's face went pale. Formally, her voice loud enough for Nurse Gable to hear, she said, "All patients are given the finest care, Miss Finch. You should focus on your own recovery." But then, as she helped Ilara to her feet, she leaned in, her lips close to Ilara's ear, her breath a warm, shocking puff of air. "There is no home," she whispered, the words so quiet they were almost a thought. "There is only the service exit." The confirmation was like a jolt of electricity. She was not alone in her knowledge. That evening, after the final bell, Anna appeared at Ilara's door holding a glass of water, a transparent excuse. She moved to the side of the bed, out of the direct line of sight of the pier hole. The lamplight from the hall cast her in shadow, making her seem older, her young face etched with a grim maturity. "I was there," Anna said, her voice a low, trembling rush of confession.
not in the room, but I was the junior nurse on duty. I had to clean up after." She swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. It wasn't a laboratory. It was an abattoir. There was shattered glass, chemicals burned into the floor, and blood. On the machine, on the trolley. Dorman was ecstatic. He was dictating his notes to Nurse Gable, talking about synaptic rupture and total cognitive collapse, as if he were describing a beautiful sunset. He didn't see a man. He saw data. Anna's family had sent her to nursing school with pride, believing she would be part of a noble, healing profession. She had sought a position at the Dorman Sanatorium because of its revolutionary reputation, wanting to be on the cutting edge of modern medicine. The reality had shattered her idealism. "He is not a healer," Anna concluded, her voice fierce with conviction. "He is a monster." In that moment, a bond was forged between them, an alliance of the prisoner and the horrified warden. "We have to show someone," Ilara urged, her voice gaining a strength she hadn't felt in months. "We need proof." "Proof is impossible," Anna countered. "His files are locked away. His staff is loyal or terrified. No one would believe a patient, and I would be dismissed or, worse, committed myself." "But you can get things," Ilara insisted, her mind racing. "You move through this place. I am trapped in this room, but I can listen. Abernathy, Catherine, they know things. We can piece it together. We can build a record." They devised a plan, their hushed words weaving a dangerous conspiracy in the dark. The sanatorium's small, sterile library, which patients could use under supervision, would be their dead drop. Anna would leave documents or notes for Ilara in the pages of a thick, rarely touched book of anatomical drawings. Ilara, in turn, would hide her own notes, a journal of the ward's whispers, a record of every missing patient and every muffled scream in the same place for Anna to retrieve and smuggle out. Their first exchange felt like a matter of life and death. Anna managed to steal a single page from Thomas Evans's file. It was his admittance sheet. Following their plan, she tucked it into the book between diagrams of the human nervous system. The next day during library hour, Ilara's hands trembled as she retrieved the book. Her heart pounded as she slipped the folded paper into the waistband of her uniform. Back in her room, she read it. It was a simple form, but at the bottom, in Dorman's neat, arrogant script, was a final entry dated the day after the experiment. Patient responded positively to advanced therapy, discharged to family care in stable condition. The lie was so blatant, so cold, it stole her breath. This was their first piece of tangible proof. She began to write, using a small nub of a pencil Anna had smuggled to her. On scraps of paper torn from the back of the library book, she documented everything Abernathy had told her about Isaac the banker, every detail Catherine sobbed about the Somnus apparatus, and the precise date and time Thomas was taken away. Their system was perilous. One afternoon, as Ilara was replacing the book on its shelf, Nurse Gable entered the library without a sound. Ilara's blood ran cold. She saw the nurse's sharp eyes sweep the room, her gaze lingering for a half-second on the anatomy book. Thinking fast, Ilara let out a small cry and collapsed to her knees, pretending her legs had given out. The diversion worked. Nurse Gable's attention shifted to her, her face a mask of annoyance at this breach of disciplined routine. The moment of danger passed, but it left Ilara trembling, the reality of their risks stark and immediate. That night, Anna found a reason to bring fresh linens to Ilara's room long after the final bell. In the shadows, they spoke. Ilara passed her the small folded notes. Anna, in turn, gave her another stolen document, the requisition form for a new, larger order of the almond-scented chemical used in the Somnus apparatus. Dorman was not just continuing his work, he was expanding it. They hid their growing collection of evidence under the loose floorboard near Ilara's bed. It was a pathetic little trove of secrets, a few stolen pages, a handful of terrified scribbles, but it was their only weapon against the scientific tyranny of the sanatorium. They were no longer a patient and a nurse. They were spies in an enemy state, bound by a dangerous secret. And as Alara lay in the dark, listening for the orderly's footsteps, she felt something she hadn't felt since the shadow first appeared in her room, a fragile, terrifying, and defiant flicker of hope.
The alliance between Alara and Anna was a fragile, desperate thing. A single candle flickering in the overwhelming darkness of the sanatorium. Their secret cache of stolen documents grew under the loose floorboard, a pathetic but damning collection of lies and requisitions. Yet it felt incomplete. They had the evidence of Dorman's crimes, the what, but they lacked the motive, the why. Without it, he was simply a monster. To truly understand their enemy, they had to understand the source of his monstrousness. The opportunity came, as they always do, cloaked in chaos. A fierce autumn storm rolled in from the Atlantic, battering the cliffs with a furious onslaught of wind and rain. The sanatorium, usually a tomb of silence, was filled with the groaning of timbers and the rattling of its sealed windows. In the middle of the night, a telegraph arrived, its urgent clicking cutting through the storm's roar. A wealthy patron of the sanatorium, a man whose donations kept Dorman's ambitions funded, had taken a grave turn on the mainland. His presence was demanded. Through the whispers of the orderlies, Anna learned that Dorman was preparing to leave immediately by carriage, a treacherous journey in the storm, but one he was compelled to make. He would be gone until at least the following afternoon. His office, the sanatorium's black heart, would be empty. That night, when Anna made her rounds, she bypassed the dispensary chute. She came to Alara's door, her face pale in the dim hallway light, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resolve. "Tonight," she whispered through the keyhole after ensuring the orderly was gone. "He's gone. It's our only chance." Alara's heart seized. "It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous to wait," Anna countered, her voice firm. "We have his lies. We need his truth. I'm going to his office." An hour later, Alara lay in her bed, her body rigid, listening to the symphony of the storm. Every shriek of the wind sounded like an alarm, every crash of a wave like a door being smashed open. She was helpless, a caged observer, while Anna moved through the belly of the beast. Anna's journey to the office was a nightmare of stealth. The storm provided cover, its cacophony masking the soft tread of her shoes. But the lightning was a traitor. With every brilliant blue-white flash, the long, empty corridors were illuminated in stark, terrifying detail, turning the familiar hallways into a gothic labyrinth where she felt exposed, hunted. She reached the heavy oak door of Dorman's office, her stolen master key trembling in her hand. The lock turned with a well-oiled click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the tense quiet. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her, and was enveloped in the scent of leather, antiseptic, and Dorman's faint, cloying cologne. The office was a shrine to a cold, rational mind. Books perfectly aligned, instruments polished and laid out in precise rows. It was the last place one would expect to find a personal secret. Patient files were in the main cabinet, locked. But Anna wasn't looking for patient files. She was looking for his file. She went to his desk, a massive block of mahogany that was the room's altar. Most drawers were unlocked, containing stationery and medical charts. The bottom right drawer, however, was locked. It was a small, ornate lock, not a modern tumbler. Using a thin metal probe from her nurse's kit, she worked at it, her fingers clumsy with fear. After an agonizing minute, she felt a faint click. The drawer did not contain files or instruments. It held only a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with handling, and a single, silver-framed daguerreotype. Anna picked up the photograph. It was of a young woman with a cascade of dark hair and eyes that were full of a gentle, melancholic light. She was beautiful, and she was looking not at the camera, but at someone just beyond it, her expression of deep, trusting love. On the back of the frame, a single word was engraved: Eleanor.
With trembling hands, Anna opened the journal. The handwriting inside was Dorman's, but it was a younger, less arrogant version of his script. The first entry was dated nearly 15 years prior. October 12, 1880. My dearest Eleanor was troubled again last night. She speaks of a paralysis, a weight on her chest. A classic presentation of hypnotic catalepsy, no doubt exacerbated by the stresses of her delicate constitution. I have prescribed a tonic and assured her it is merely a trick of the nerves. Her mind is a beautiful, intricate clockwork, and I, her devoted craftsman, shall ensure it is always perfectly timed. Anna felt a chill as she read the words. He was describing Alara's symptoms, but with a detached, clinical affection. She skipped ahead, the entries growing frantic. May 4, 1881. The tonic has no effect. The laudanum prescribed by Dr. Albright only dulls her senses, making her more susceptible to what she calls the shadow. She insists it is a presence, an entity. I find myself frustrated by this persistence of superstition in a mind so brilliant. I must redouble my efforts to ground her in rational thought. Fear is the true disease here. The final entries were written in a spidery, barely controlled scrawl, the ink blotted in places as if by a falling tear or a shaking hand. November 2, 1881. It is worse, so much worse. She awoke screaming last night, not from a dream, but from the waking nightmare. She described a door within her own mind that she felt being pulled through. She begged me to hold on to her, to not let it take her. I held her until dawn, feeling her tremble, my science a useless shield against the terror in her eyes. I feel like a fraud. I can chart the brain, but I cannot chart the soul. The last entry was almost illegible. November 4, 1881. She is gone. She went to sleep in my arms, exhausted from the previous night's ordeal. I awoke at 3 in the morning to a profound cold in the room. Her side of the bed was empty. I found her on the floor. Her eyes were open wide, staring at something on the ceiling I could not see. There was no mark on her, no sign of struggle. The coroner, that old fool, will call it a seizure, a failure of the heart. He is wrong. I was there. For a fleeting moment as I woke, I felt it too. A presence, a pressure, a deep, resonant silence where a life used to be. It was not a sickness that took her. It was a place she found in her sleep, a door she couldn't close. She didn't die. She was taken. Anna closed the journal, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped it. The truth was more horrifying than she could imagined. Dorman wasn't a sadist. He was a ghost hunter, a man whose rational, scientific world had been shattered by a single, inexplicable event. He hadn't built the sanatorium to heal the sick. He had built it to hunt for the thing that took his wife. The somnus apparatus wasn't an instrument of torture. It was his attempt to build a key, to find the door that had claimed Eleanor. The patients, Thomas, Isaac, Catherine, they weren't just subjects. They were expeditions. He was sending them into the dark, uncharted territory of sleep, hoping one of them would find the way, hoping to map the landscape of death itself. His obsession wasn't to cure sleep disorders, but to conquer sleep, to master it, to ensure no one could ever be stolen from him again. He was a man haunted, trying to wage a war against the phantom with scalpels and chemicals. Suddenly, a loud thunder shook the building, and Anna heard footsteps in the hall. An orderly doing a security check due to the storm. Panic seized her. She shoved the journal and the photograph back into the drawer and locked it, and slid back into the shadows behind the desk, just as the beam of a lantern swept across the office door. The footsteps passed. She fled, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She didn't return to the ward until just before dawn, her face ashen. She waited for the gap between patrols and then hissed into the vent. "Alara, I know." She recounted what she had found in a torrent of horrified whispers. She described the journal, the photograph, the story of Eleanor. As Alara listened, the final piece of the terrifying puzzle clicked into place. She understood why Dorman's gaze had always held that strange, intense curiosity.
It wasn't just her affliction that interested him. It was her resemblance to his dead wife, to the ghost he was chasing. She was not just a promising subject for his research. She was a vessel, a chance for him to recreate the event, to face the shadow that had defeated him once before, but this time armed with his terrible machine. He wasn't trying to cure her nightmare. He was trying to enter it.
Dr. Dorman returned with the gray, storm-battered dawn. The journey had clearly taken its toll. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. But beneath the weariness there was a new, unsettling fire. The news from the mainland had been good. His patron would recover, and his funding was secure. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of a fresh bruise and a restless, agitated sea. He did not wait. That morning, Ilara was summoned, not to his office, but to the heavy oak door at the end of the night ward corridor, the door through which Thomas Evans had disappeared. Dorman stood before it, looking not at Ilara, but at the door itself, as if it were a gateway to another world. Nurse Gable stood at his side, a silent, white-clad sentinel. "Miss Finch," Dorman began, his voice low and resonant with a strange excitement, "your progress has been remarkable. The simple therapies have quieted the surface of your mind, but the root of the disorder, the true seat of the malady, remains. It is a deep, persistent echo." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were terrifying. They were not the eyes of a doctor, but of a zealot on the verge of a revelation. "Your case presents with a fascinating, almost perfect correlation to a previous case I studied many years ago, a case of profound, terminal somnolence." Eleanor, Ilara thought, the name a shard of ice in her gut. He was speaking of his wife. "That case was a failure," Dorman continued, a flicker of ancient pain crossing his features. "I was armed only with theory then. Now I have the tools. I have perfected the apparatus. I have calibrated it to not merely observe, but to enter, to navigate. We are not going to simply silence your nightmare, Ilara. We are going to map it, and we are going to conquer it from within. You have been selected for the final procedure, a complete purification, tonight at midnight." The words were elegant death sentence. He was offering her the honor of being his next sacrifice on the altar of his obsession. She felt her blood run cold, but she forced her face to remain a placid mask of acceptance. She nodded meekly, playing the part of the grateful, broken patient. "You are a brave young woman," Dorman said, placing a cold hand on her shoulder. "You are a pioneer. What we accomplish tonight will change the face of medicine forever." When she was locked back in her room, the reality of the timeline crashed down upon her. Midnight. They had less than 14 hours. She scrambled to the vent. "Abernathy!" she hissed. The watchmaker's reply was a frantic, rustling whisper. "I heard. The door was open. I heard it all. He spoke of you like you were a key. God help you, child." The wait for Anna was an eternity. Every creak of the building, every distant shout of a gull was a potential discovery, a sign that their fragile conspiracy had been shattered. When Anna finally arrived with the midday meal, her face was a mask of professional calm, but her eyes were wide with terror. She had heard the news. "Tonight," Ilara whispered as Anna set the tray down, positioning her body to block the peephole. Anna's nod was barely perceptible. "The storm knocked out the main telegraph line," she whispered back, her voice a strained rush of air. "They're sending a man to repair it in the morning. No one can get a message out before then. We are completely on our own." She straightened up. "Be ready. After the final bell, feign sleep. Do not take the sedative. When you hear the chapel bell toll 10, it only rings on the hour. That is my signal. That is when I will make my move." The rest of the day was a slow-motion nightmare. The hours crawled by, each tick of an unseen clock a step closer to Dorman's machine. At dinner, Ilara forced down the tasteless broth, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the spoon. When the orderly came with the sedative, she took the glass, and, as he turned his back to mark his chart, she poured the contents into the soil of the wilting potted fern by her desk. She lay down in bed, her heart a frantic trapped bird, and began the long wait for the 10th hour. The hum started at 9:30, low, menacing, and full of promise. The somnus apparatus was warming up. It was a hungry sound. Finally, through the thick stone walls, she heard the distant, mournful chime of the chapel bell. 1, 2, 10. It was time. In the nurse's station, Anna took a deep, steadying breath. Her plan was desperate. She walked calmly to the small dispensary where a junior orderly was drowsing over a medical journal. "Orderly Price," she said, her voice sharp. "Dr. Dorman requires a fresh canister of ether for the procedure. The one in his laboratory is nearly empty." The orderly, groggy and eager to please, lumbered over to his feet. "Right, nurse." As he turned to the supply closet, Anna moved. She lifted a heavy porcelain basin from a table and, with a silent prayer, brought it down hard on the back of his head. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. Her heart screaming in her chest, she dragged his unconscious body into the closet and locked the door. Then she grabbed the ring of master keys from his belt and ran, a ghost in the silent corridors. In her room, Ilara heard the faint scrape of a key in her lock. The door opened, and Anna stood there, her face as white as her uniform. "Come, we have minutes at most." Ilara didn't hesitate. She threw back her covers and went directly to the loose floorboard, prying it up with her trembling fingers. She grabbed their pathetic, precious collection of evidence, Dorman's lies, his requisitions, her own scribbled testimonies from the ward. They stuffed the papers into the pockets of Anna's cloak. They slipped into the hallway, a deep river of shadows. The hum of the machine was louder here, a constant, vibrating threat that guided them towards the service exit and away from the main ward. Every flicker of a gas lamp, every gust of wind rattling a window frame sent a fresh wave of terror through them. They were halfway down the final corridor when they heard it. Footsteps, sharp, heavy, and approaching fast. "Hide!" Anna hissed, pulling Ilara into a shallow alcove used for storing cleaning supplies. They flattened themselves against the cold stone, hidden behind a tall metal bucket. Two burly orderlies appeared, marching with a grim purpose. They were heading for Ilara's room, to fetch her. "Doctor's getting impatient," one grumbled. "Says the atmospheric pressure is perfect tonight for a, what did he call it? A cognitive breach. Whatever it is, I just hope she doesn't scream like the last one." The words hung in the air as they passed, each one a hammer blow against Ilara's sanity. They were seconds ahead of her own abduction. When the footsteps faded, they darted from the alcove and ran, their flight silent and desperate. They reached the heavy service door at the end of the hall. This was it, the door Thomas had been wheeled through. Anna fumbled with the keys, her hands slick with sweat. The first key didn't fit. The second scraped but wouldn't turn. From the direction of the night ward they heard the orderly's returning footsteps, sharp, now an angry, questioning shout. They had found her room empty. "It's rusted!" Anna cried in a panicked whisper, wrestling with the third key. The hum of the somnus apparatus in the nearby laboratory suddenly rose in pitch, as if it sensed its prize was escaping. The footsteps were getting closer, now accompanied by the sharp, authoritative voice of Nurse Gable. "Come on," Ilara prayed, pushing against the door with all her might. With a tortured groan of metal, the lock finally turned. Anna threw her shoulder against the door, and it burst open, revealing not an exit, but a wall of roaring, wind-whipped darkness. They stumbled out onto a narrow, muddied path that ran along the cliff's edge. The cold, salt-laced rain hit them like a physical blow. The door slammed shut behind them. They stood, gasping, on the precipice of the world. Below, the sea churned in a black, violent frenzy. Behind them, the sanatorium was a hulking, dark shape. A moment later, a light flared in a window, then another. A loud, clanging alarm bell began to ring, its frantic peal a scream of rage that was barely audible over the roaring symphony of the storm. They were out, but they were trapped on a crumbling cliff edge with a monster awake and aware, and nowhere left to run.
The world was reduced to a razor's edge of mud and roaring chaos. The alarm bell was a frantic metallic heartbeat behind them, swallowed intermittently by the primal scream of the wind. Ilara and Anna scrambled along the cliff path, their feet sinking into the slick, treacherous mud, the sea a churning black void to their left. The rain was not falling. It was being driven sideways, a horizontal assault of icy needles that blinded them and stole their breath. Lights flared to life in the sanatorium windows, casting long, distorted yellow rectangles onto the storm-racked grounds. Shouts echoed from the door they had just escaped, angry, urgent commands. A moment later, the bobbing, weaving lights of lanterns appeared, cutting through the darkness like angry wasps. The hunt had begun. "This way!" Anna shouted over the gale, pulling Ilara by the hand. "The path leads down to the old fisherman's cove. It's our only chance." They half ran, half slid down the path as it began its steep, winding descent. The mud sucked at their shoes, and with every step, small sections of the cliff edge crumbled away, disappearing into the roaring abyss below. Behind them, the lantern lights were drawing closer, their pursuers far more sure-footed on the familiar terrain. They rounded a sharp bend and saw it. Or rather, they saw the absence of it. A recent landslide, likely caused by the storm, had sheared the path completely away. A 10-foot chasm of raw, wet earth separated them from the continuing trail. It was a dead end. They were trapped. Anna let out a strangled cry of despair, her shoulders slumping. Ilara's brief, defiant hope curdled into a cold, hard knot of terror in her stomach. The lantern lights grew brighter, pinning them against the cliff face. First, the orderlies appeared, their large frames silhouetted against the light. Then Nurse Gable came, her white uniform already splattered with mud, her face a mask of cold fury. And finally, Dr. Alistair Dorman stepped into the circle of light. He was not wearing a coat. The rain plastered his fine clothes to his body, and his hair was a wild, dark mess. But it was his face that stopped Ilara's heart. The veneer of scientific reason, of calm authority, had been completely stripped away. His eyes were burning with a martyr's fire, a terrifying fusion of rage and ecstasy. He wasn't looking at them as escaped patients, but as traitors to a sacred cause. "Fools!" he roared, his voice nearly ripped away by the wind. "You cannot run from your own mind! You cannot run from salvation!" "Stay back, Doctor!" Anna shouted over the gale, pulling Ilara by the hand. "We have everything, the records, the lies about Thomas Evans, Isaac's file. We will tell the world what you've done." Dorman laughed, a wild, unhinged sound that was more frightening than the storm. "The world? The world is a slumbering child that fears the dark. I am the one who dares to strike a match. You have papers. I have the precipice of a new reality. They will call you hysterical. They will call me a genius." He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Ilara. It was a look of pure, predatory hunger. "The apparatus is calibrated, Ilara. It is tuned to the unique frequency of your fear. Don't you see? What you call a nightmare is a doorway, the same doorway. I will not be denied entrance again." He lunged.
It was not the movement of a doctor, but of a desperate man trying to seize a ghost. He shoved Anna aside, his fingers grabbing for the sleeve of Ilara's shift. She scrambled backwards, her heel slipping on the crumbling edge of the chasm. For a terrifying second, she was suspended over the void. Anna, recovering her balance, threw herself at Dorman, trying to pull him back. He shook her off with a snarl, his focus absolute, his hand closing around Ilara's wrist. His grip was like iron. "I have you," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing with the reflection of the lanterns. "Now you will show me." But the edge, already weakened by the storm and their struggle, could not hold them. With a great groaning sigh, the ground beneath their feet gave way. Ilara screamed as she fell, but her fall was arrested with a jarring jerk that nearly tore her arm from its socket. Anna had thrown herself flat on the remaining path and grabbed Ilara's other hand, her knuckles white, her face a mask of grim determination. Below her, Dorman still clung to her wrist, his entire body weight dangling over the abyss. His obsession was the only thing keeping him from falling. His other hand clawed at the muddy cliff face, finding no purchase. He looked up, his face a horrifying canvas of shock, rage, and a sudden dawning terror. For the first time, he was staring into the very abyss he had sought to map. And he was afraid. "Don't let go," he gasped, not to her, but to the shadow of his own ambition. The sodden papers spilled from Anna's cloak, fluttering for a moment in the wind like pale, frantic moths before being swallowed by the darkness. The proof was gone. "I can't hold you both!" Anna screamed, her own grip slipping in the mud. In that final, terrible moment, Ilara looked down into the eyes of her tormentor. She saw not a monster, but a man so hollowed out by his own grief that he had tried to fill the void with the souls of others. She saw the ghost of Eleanor in his eyes, and then, with a strength born of pure primal survival, she pulled her arm free. Dorman's eyes went wide, his grip vanished. For a single silent second, he hung suspended in the air, a man untethered from the world. Then, with a cry that was swallowed by the storm, he was gone, consumed by the darkness he so desperately wished to conquer. Anna and the orderlies hauled a sobbing, mud-caked Ilara back onto the solid path. They stood there, shivering and broken, as Nurse Gable stared into the chasm where her master had vanished, her face utterly blank. The hunt was over. The unwaking dawn arrived, cold and gray. The storm had broken, leaving a world washed clean and brutally clear. The telegraph repairman, arriving that morning, found a scene of quiet institutional chaos. The local constabulary was summoned, and the story, no longer just whispers in a dark ward, began to unravel. Abernathy, Catherine, and the other residents of the night ward, blinking in the unfamiliar sun, gave their halting, terrified testimonies. The discovery of the hidden laboratory, with the monstrous Somnus apparatus at its center, confirmed their tales. Dorman's private journals, retrieved from his office, told the rest of the story. Not of a scientist, but of a grieving husband whose quest for answers had devolved into a monstrous obsession. The sanatorium's reputation was not shattered, it was vaporized. The newspapers, hungry for a scandal, dubbed it the House of Somnolent Horrors. The promise of a modern cure was exposed as a brutal pseudo-scientific campaign of torture, rooted in the private nightmare of one man. Ilara never returned to Havenwood. Her testimony, given in a quiet, steady voice, was the final nail in the sanatorium's coffin. She never again saw the shadow in her sleep. Dorman, in a final terrible irony, had taken it with him into the abyss. But peace was a country she could no longer find on a map. She was free of her nightmare,
but she was now haunted by its cure. The grim annals of medicine are filled with figures like Alistair Dorman, men of their time, blinded by scientific hubris. In the desperate attempt to understand the mind, they treated it not as a delicate ecosystem, but as a faulty machine. They used water tortures to shock the nerves, rigid schedules to break the will, and sensory deprivation to purify the soul. The brutal infancy of sleep science was not born in quiet observation, but in these frantic, often cruel attempts to map and subdue the most vulnerable state of human consciousness. Dorman was not an anomaly. He was an extreme manifestation of an era that believed the darkness of the mind could be excised with a scalpel, a chemical, or a jolt of electricity.